I gave a lot of you, if you came in a little late, a brochure about our new Gem and Mineral Museum that we're building right here in downtown Tucson. My role with the University of Arizona is managing the build-out of what will be a pretty spectacular gem and mineral venue for everyone when they come to town, and we hope to be open about the middle of 2020. So I'm going to run through a topic that we don't always think about, but can gemstones change history, and how do they influence all the periods of time that we go through? So one of our first records of gemstones in written form of course, relates back to the Old Testament of the Hebrew Bible, talking about the breastplate of Aaron, where we have 4 rows of 3 gemstones. This is probably the biggest controversy, not whether something's been heated or oiled, but what were these stones? And we have references, but of course the language was different then. So the best thing we can come up with is basically this as a description of what the stones in the breastplate of Aaron might have been. It's a very elaborate description, as you can read here, but as far as how the linen was manufactured, how it was to be sized, the span and breadth, and then of course what stones were required as part of the description, and then the other ones that we often just see as visualizations. This was also the precursor to what we consider now our modern day birthstones. This, a lot of people don't realize, but probably was started, again, just to try to sell more jewelry back 50 to 70 years ago. One of the more interesting things about the birthstones, over time let me see if I can make the pointer work. Yep. We added tanzanite throughout time for December. A lot of people don't like gem rocks, such as turquoise, so that was one that was added so we'd have a gemstone. And then most recently, a year plus ago, we added spinel for peridot. It's interesting to me, peridot, of course, is an Arizona gemstone, and it seems that everyone born in August hates peridot. And yet, anyone born any other month of the year loves peridot. So for the trade to kind of come in and say, okay, we'll give you an alternative there. Of course, diamonds predate. We know that trade in diamonds in India probably started 800 BC as a commercial source. They were all alluvial at that time. No one did any mining. They were found in alluvial dry creek and river beds. And they were only for the wealthy because they were really, really scarce. And the word, the original Greek was adamas, where we get our adamantine luster that remains today as a big descriptor for how a diamond is separated from other stones. And it means that it's invincible, a sign of power, and of course they've been represented by the crown jewels pretty much forever. Of course, we know diamonds really aren't invincible because they will cleave and break. We can burn them up and other things, but it's all about marketing, even dating back to the 1400s. We think we can trace the first engagement ring back to the Roman Emperor Maximilian, who was betrothed to Mary of Burgundy. A lot of these relationships we're going to look at are a potential king from one country and a potential queen from another to join empires together, and we'll also see how they're torn apart in much the same way. This original ring was really not to be given to Mary, but to be given to her father as a dowry, and in return, the father gave them a gift of land, which turned out to be Belgium, which had just started cutting diamonds. So it was really a pretty good deal that he traded one diamond ring and then inherited the whole diamond trade for a while. This was also when the fourth finger was determined on the left hand. It was thought to be the vein of love with a direct connection to the heart. And in the earlier days of Catholicism, there was a waiting period required. Once you were betrothed, you couldn't just go and get married. And the rings were actually made of iron and resembled in the literature a shackle. So it was given to the woman, and it basically meant hands off. She's spoken for, but we're just in the waiting period. And we have a nice representation of what that ring might have looked like. It was faceted and cut. It wasn't cleaved because our cleavage plane doesn't run straight across the octahedron. So this was some of the earliest faceting that we know about. Of course, De Beers, diamonds sort of shifted a little bit, and we've all, I think, become familiar with The Diamond is Forever. We could probably hum the tune that they had going with it from the 1980s. But significant deposits came on board in the late 1800s. And so now we went from a stone that was rare and for royalty, maybe just a couple of pounds a year, up to tons and tons of diamonds. So De Beers, controlling over 90% of the market, had to come up with a slogan or a way to convince people you really need one of these diamonds. And at the end of World War II, diamonds became a necessity for all people. And as people became engaged, it was sort of a requirement that you have a diamond. And of course, we all know the 4 C's were devised as a way of grading and distinguishing diamonds and qualifying diamonds. But the end result of that was people would feel good no matter what size diamond they had. They may have a smaller diamond, but it was a lot better color, or it had a lot better clarity. So there were really a lot of reasons that these things came into play. Marie Antoinette, this is probably one of the most interesting stories, I think, in tracing diamonds back. Marie Antoinette was actually an Austrian young lady. Her mother was Queen of Austria or ruler of Austria. I can't keep all of those titles straight. And she was betrothed at an early age, about 14 years old, to marry Louis XVI. In the meantime, Louis XIV had a mistress, and he commissioned one of the better jewelers of the day to create the most extravagant diamond necklace possible. So this was the grandfather of Louis XVI, and this is what was commissioned. And it was for his mistress, and no one liked his mistress. And in the meantime, Louis XIV passed away. And so here was this great necklace that had been in the works for several years, fully loaded with diamonds. And so the jewelers decided they would go to Marie Antoinette and try to get her to purchase the necklace. She wasn't really interested too much, and we have early renditions, so we know exactly what the necklace appeared to look like. Contained 2,800 carats of diamonds, 647 stones. And the jeweler had taken a lot of this material on memo for many years. So when they discovered that they were unable to sell the jewelry, they were really quite worried because they'd really stuck their necks out, and this was all the production they had been done. And so Marie Antoinette, the great scandal of the day, was accused falsely of adultery with a cardinal of the Catholic Church. And this necklace took an interesting twist of events. Basically, someone posing as Marie Antoinette was able to take possession of the necklace under the pretense that the royal court would pay for it, and then the necklace was taken into Europe and dismantled and sold. Later, Marie Antoinette was absolved from all the crime. They found that the documents had been forged. They didn't sign them correctly, much like forgers of today, where they sign your name differently or use a different lettering or whatever it might have been. So she was completely absolved of all the crime, and then about a year later beheaded anyway. It's interesting because this was the first appearance of tabloids. So the National Enquirer actually started around the scandal for Marie Antoinette. And while Marie Antoinette was imprisoned, Marie Antoinette was very fond of jewelry. She just didn't like the necklace she was accused of having. And the royal depository was looted 4 times on 4 occasions while Marie Antoinette was in prison. Most of the stones were recovered except one, the most famous being the Tavernier blue, recut from being the French blue. The original history was Tavernier had stolen this from the eye of a Hindu idol, weighed about 115 carats. I'm not sure how we know that exactly, but it makes the story great. So the French blue was thought to have disappeared forever. It was recut apparently in London and was purchased by a wealthy banker. And it's very interesting because this banker was very meticulous with his collection of gemstones, which he was very fond of. And he had a meticulous database of every stone in his collection minus one, and it was this blue diamond. So it was thought that probably this stone he knew had some ill origin, so he just never documented that he ever owned it. It was associated with a curse, of course, but at the time that he passed away, his family was, there was a lot of illness, a lot of bankruptcy, and they were forced to sell these stones, including the Hope, what has now become the Hope Diamond. Cartier was the first to purchase this stone in 1910, and there were no buyers for it. It was just a ridiculously priced stone. We can see where Tavernier started with it here at the top. Of course, Tavernier apparently stole lots of diamonds in his life while he was on his travels, and he basically was exiled and died penniless, even though he was the broker for some of the most famous diamonds in history. The French blue, of course, with Louis XVI, the Sun King, 14, excuse me, and then passing on to Marie Antoinette, and then Cartier, later purchased by Harry Winston. And Harry Winston, we don't want to say embellished the story, but he's the one that created the great story of the Hope and the curse that went along with it. And of course, it's easy looking backwards to find natural disasters and illness and death and then just try to relate them all back to the stone. Harry Winston, too, was totally unable to sell the stone once it was purchased. And so it was donated to the Smithsonian, and it's said to be the largest IRS tax deduction in history. A couple other diamonds of note, again with ties to thievery from Hindu temples and idols. The Black Orlov, 195 carat stone. The first dealer that owned that jumped from a skyscraper in New York City. Later there were 2 princesses that both jumped to their death as well. And then the White Orlov, which was a gift from Prince Orlov to Queen Catherine II of Russia. And all of that was lost during the Bolshevik Revolution. So the story is that for the White Orlov, that a ship's captain purchased the stone for 2,000 pounds. When he arrived in port, it was sold for 12,000 pounds, and then by the time Prince Orlov received it, it sold for 90,000 pounds. This sounds a little similar to some of our gem deals today, so it had early origins. Of course, one of the most famous diamonds, the Koh-i-Noor, 106 carat stone, part of the British Crown Jewels. And it was such a magnificent stone that it went on display at the Great Exhibition. There was a cage built over it. This elaborate stand was created by a jeweler to showcase the stone, and people walked by it and thought nothing of it. It was very disheartening to the royal family that they had this great diamond, and so the stone was later recut. It's interesting to note that in the 1800s is when India became part of the British Empire, and one of the 5 conditions for becoming part of the crown was they surrender all diamonds. So a lot of times we wonder, how did the British really end up with all of the magnificent crown jewels they did? All diamonds of origin from India, and all basically part of that merger process. I think they got the short end of the stick, but I'm not one to judge. Of course, when we get to the United States, wampum was our kind of jewelry, currency, monetary thing. And it was interesting because for many years I assumed, coming from the East Coast and loving clams, that the purple beads came from the clam and the white beads came from the clam. But in reality, the white comes from the whelk shell and the purple from the clam shells. So it's interesting that even in the early days that the Native Americans felt a significance from having 2 different origins, even though they were working the same materials. And the purple represented spirituality and royalty, and then the white was money and purity. So now we enter the age of exploration and the Spanish Empire at the time. We had Ferdinand and Isabella, who really set out to the age of exploration and expanding their horizons. There were great crown jewels for Spain, all of which were used to finance the exploration. And of course, we all know this gentleman, Christopher Columbus, and we always knew that he was out after gold and emeralds and not so much pearls, but that was really part of the journey. And the main reason that Spain said they were exploring was to spread Catholicism. The reality was most of what Columbus did was gather people into slavery. So it's a little bit ironic, I think. Of course, emeralds were one of the things. It's interesting, too, because Columbus really didn't, his first voyages, find any treasure. And so we come to the fable of the lost city of gold, El Dorado, which was basically just made up by Columbus. His first journey, he basically enslaved people, and the gold and silver he brought were the personal adornments of the people that he captured. So he created the story of the lost city of gold just so he could continue his exploits. The early explorers were told 10% of their bounty would belong to them and the rest to the crown. We know from ships' manifests that they were never really honest, the explorers. And one of the most famous Spanish shipwrecks for North America was the Atocha, which was a Spanish galleon during a little bit later time period, but it was noted that probably only 20% of that cargo was on a manifest. Tons of gold, silver, emeralds, and bounty. So I think when you talk about pirates in the seas, you know, it's always hard to distinguish if they work for the government or not. So the story that came out of South America, which is interesting, that we don't hear as much about, is the story of the emerald parrot. And the Incas, of course, were in the land of emeralds, and basically the story was that there was an emerald the size of an ostrich egg. Some people debate whether it was actually just a large crystal or whether it had been carved into a parrot. And the temple, the people that would come to worship in the temple would bring small emeralds as a sacrifice to the big emerald. So as you can imagine, this temple accumulated a huge treasure trove of emeralds. When the Spanish came in, they basically looted the temple. The Incans knew they were coming, and the big emerald was taken and hidden away, never to be found again. We're not sure if this is, again, a story like the Lost City of Gold or not, but it did open up the world to the emerald mines of Muzo and Chivor. It was said along the way, especially in later years, that a lot of the emeralds in South America were found by chickens, because the chickens roamed freely, and if you have any farm background, you know chickens ingest little bits and grains of rock because it helps them break up the grains. And so people would find little piles of emeralds around and know there had to be a mine close by just due to the feeding habits of the chicken. I'm not sure if that's not more of a tall tale than the emerald parrot. Pearls, of course, are my passion, and as I mentioned a few slides back, part of the age of exploration was based around pearls and the pearl trade. Of course, we equate the origins of pearls with the Persian Gulf. Certainly, during early times, that was where the majority of pearls were found from the oysters being fished in those areas. And then to the most famous pearl in history, La Peregrina. Later we saw, maybe 3 years ago, this was a pearl that had been given to Elizabeth Taylor and brought the highest price ever at auction for a pearl, something over $11 million. So the story of La Peregrina is actually very interesting. It was actually found off the coast of Panama, so it's actually a New World pearl. It was the finest ever known at the time from any area whatsoever. It was found by a slave working on a ship, and he was able to trade the pearl for his freedom. It was taken back and gifted to the King of Spain at the time, Philip II. And we've got quite a journey. The pearl was nicknamed the Wanderer, and as we go through where the pearl went, you'll see why it was named the Wanderer. And do we think it really did change history? So, as I said, it belonged to the King of Spain. Philip offered this to Mary I of England as a dowry and a sort of an engagement pearl, if you will. And again, we've joined two countries together. Mary cherished the pearl, and they were betrothed. But interestingly enough, Mary's sister really coveted that pearl. To her, it was the most fabulous thing in the world. This is Queen Elizabeth. And Queen Elizabeth is always represented not only wearing pearls, but having them stitched into her garments, really just over-the-top extravagance. When her sister Mary I passed away, Philip offered the pearl to Elizabeth, but Elizabeth despised him, and so she refused the pearl. Philip went back to Spain. The countries were separate again, and Elizabeth was so enthralled that she commissioned the Navy to go out and find her a pearl of equal beauty. She hired two famous privateers. Again, privateers, another fancy government name for pirate. And she sent them to explore and to root and to plunder. And we need to remember that during this time, the Spanish were still the main explorers in the New World. Of course, Sir Walter Raleigh settled the first colony of North America, Roanoke, Virginia, and that was named after the Queen because the Queen never married, so it was the Virgin Queen. So, green with envy, it caused the fall of the entire Spanish Armada. The English Navy had very small boats, and they went to war against each other. The first campaign, the British went to Spain and sunk every Spanish ship in the harbor. They never even were allowed to leave. The second one, they put all their money back into building a new navy, went to war with the British, and were defeated again. And interestingly, the reason that the British won this naval battle, they had smaller boats, fewer boats, but it was the first time a boat could reverse. So they were actually able to dodge and maneuver around. They sunk the whole armada, and that was the beginning of the British Empire. And it was all based on Elizabeth really wanting a pearl as fine as her sister had had. And that's why all of her clothing had pearls stitched in it, because they brought back tremendous treasure hoards of pearls, but none as fabulous as La Peregrina. Interestingly, the pearl next left Spain and went to Napoleon Bonaparte's brother and wandered around a bit more until Elizabeth Taylor ended up with it. But Napoleon was known for loving emeralds, so the crown for his first wife, Josephine, of course, really embellished with emeralds. Today it is now the royal crown jewels for Queen Sonja of Norway. But a lot of times that wasn't good. Here we go. Napoleon's second wife, again, had a crown with emeralds, and interestingly enough, that crown found its way to Van Cleef & Arpels. All the emeralds were replaced with Persian turquoise, and the emeralds were sold off individually as royal crown jewels for everyone. This crown was later donated to the Smithsonian and is there today. The Russians, the Romanovs, one of the most successful Russian families in time. And what do we have from Russia? Fabergé. Not just the eggs, but Fabergé was the first jeweler that took what we consider gems and jewels and made them into artistic things of beauty. You know, today you can walk through the show floors at AGTA and you see jewelry like you would expect, but you also see artistic creations. And this was a time when Fabergé was making cigarette boxes, small works of arts, and of course the most famous of all, the Fabergé eggs. The interesting thing about Fabergé was he not only hired jewelers, but he hired chemists, he hired artists. At the time, there were only 4 colors or types of gold, and he perfected 5 new colors of gold. So he was very artistic, very creative, and very scientific. He was also thought to be one of the first jewelers to really look at a cost analysis of how much time did this take, what was the cost of materials, what was the asking price, and did I make money? The eggs themselves were, of course, the Russians at the time were very much Orthodox, was their main religion, and so Easter was their main holiday. And of course, we always equate eggs with Easter, both here and back in Russia at the time. And so the Fabergé eggs were gifted to the royal family, both by Fabergé, and they were bought by the rulers at the time for their wives. And during the time period, they collected and amassed 53 eggs as part of the royal collection. And as you know, the eggs were very beautiful and ornate from the outside, but they were taken apart and would have treasure inside or music boxes, or would retransform themselves into something totally different. Total of 52, so everything's going well. We've got beautiful treasure. Most all of these empires, there was a huge disparity between the wealthy and the poor, and to have this level of extravagance when people were starving to death, it just didn't sit well. So then we get revolution. So Lenin becomes powerful, and of course the beginnings of communism, socialism, and social reform. Fabergé, all of the royal bounty is confiscated. A lot of the gold and silver was melted and destroyed forever. The one thing that was spared were the Fabergé eggs. Even the socialists and the communists said these are just too beautiful. They're a representation against everything we believe, but they're just too beautiful and we can't destroy them. Fabergé was exiled into Switzerland. Of course, the world wars are beginning, and the Fabergé workshops became munitions plants, and Fabergé's sons were imprisoned. And so to help fund some of the revolution and the conflict, of course, a lot of these items were confiscated and either melted and sold as raw product, or they were sold off in other countries to fund the revolution. A lot of this funding for the revolution, of course, goes back to Germany, but there was also funding from the United States as well. But don't tell anybody, because that's not a good thing. The Stalin area, of course, the eggs are sold. So enters in Armand Hammer. Very successful. His father was a very successful pharmaceutical kingpin in the U.S., legal pharmaceuticals. Armand was a communist sympathizer and spent a lot of time in Russia, supposedly on pharmaceutical business. And in reality, he was smuggling all of the Fabergé treasure, mostly to the United States. Two of the people buying most of it was Malcolm Forbes, of course we all know is a great American tycoon, and Andrew Mellon. And if that name doesn't really ring a bell, he was what would be the equivalent of our Treasury Secretary today. So he's buying somewhat contraband Russian treasures. The market became so flooded and counterfeits were rampant. They were doing some of the original trunk shows in major shopping centers selling Fabergé goods. And of course, the fact that the factories had been seized, they were able to just mass produce these things and stamp them Fabergé. One of the imprisoned sons was taken out of prison and was required to do the appraisals for what these things would sell for in other countries. So it was really a sad time for the Fabergé empire. Back to pearls again. You know, a lot of times we don't respect pearls as being what they are for various reasons. But Japan had been an isolated country for hundreds of years, primarily because they wanted to protect Buddhism and their religion. And so the U.S. government sent Admiral Matthew Perry over to kind of negotiate with Japan and to sort of try to include them in this new world trade order. He went over there in a warship, so I think the impression was probably pretty big. A lot of this circled around the desire and need for whale oil at the time. So Japan sort of took this to heart and decided that they would become a technological leader based on the fact they were being forced into the world economy. And probably the person to me that started this technological revolution would have been Mikimoto. Mikimoto, we know, is the father of cultured pearls. At the time, all pearls were basically coming out of the Persian Gulf, natural pearls, very expensive. And he really fell in love with pearls, and he was part of a noodle making factory, and he lived in an island where the Japanese pearl divers, the Ama divers, were all topless women. And so it's hard to say whether he was enamored with the topless women or with the pearls, but in either case, he started looking at culturing pearls and perfected that grafting technique. The Japanese pearl industry, cultured pearls as we know them, was born at that time. And Mikimoto's goal was to ensure that every woman on earth was able to have a strand of pearls. And he wanted to make them affordable enough that everyone could purchase them, and if they couldn't afford them, he decided he would give them a strand of pearls. He created tremendous masterpieces for the Chicago World's Fair. He created a recreation of Mount Vernon, all made out of pearls, and then later a Liberty Bell made out of pearls and diamonds for the New York exhibition. He was also very concerned with quality, so, did the microphone die? Okay. With lesser quality pearls, so he was said to eat a pearl every day. We don't know if it was a good pearl or a bad pearl, but he did destroy over 70,000 pearls from a 1-ton harvest. Anything that didn't meet his criteria was destroyed because he wanted everyone to have a good strand of pearls. Of course, the end of the World War II, Mikimoto's pearls were very affordable, and many of the soldiers brought them back to their wives, mothers, sisters, and daughters. And then, of course, the legacy. So again, not just about making money, but how can we showcase things? One of his most, that wasn't good, was it? Here we go. One of his most famous pieces, the Wheels and Arrows. This was a very intricately created piece of jewelry that would come apart and make into, I think, 11 different pieces of jewelry. And the Tacho Ren. These pearls ranged up to 14.5 millimeters, which was unheard of for a cultured pearl. As you know, most are probably in the 6 to 8 millimeter range. Secondary nucleations now today boosting that size up, but at the time these were all first generation grafts and the very best of the best. They were not for sale at any price, and people always were trying to buy the Tacho Ren from Mikimoto, and he said, no, these are mine. And he didn't wear the pearls, but he always kept them on him, apparently in his pocket. We all know that probably your pocket with change and keys is not the best place, but they were his pearls. And then one of the most interesting stories, Cartier, when they moved to New York, had a fairly good location, but they really wanted to be in a prime location. This was This was a house that was owned by the Plant family. Maisie Plant was a very extravagant socialite at the time and lived in this building with her husband. And she was so enamored with pearls that she wanted to trade the apartment for a double strand of natural pearls. Those are South Sea pearls that you see her wearing, all naturals. Let me tell you how many there are because it's interesting. So the large strand has 73 pearls, the secondary strand 55 pearls. It was said to be asked by Cartier $1 million in 1917, and so the deal was trading that strand of pearls and $100 for the future home of Cartier. A lot of this information and more is out of this book. I was going to call this a book review, but none of you would have come. But it's a very fascinating story of how gemstones really interject themselves into every major time period of recorded history. And as gemologists or jewelry collectors, we all like books. But most of our books are sort of textbooks, and they're not the kind of book you can sit and just read of interest. And this is probably the most exciting book I've read in over 20 years. And it outlines these stories, as I said, and more. And I would highly encourage you, if you're interested, to read more. So we get back to the original question, do gemstones influence history? And my feeling is, as long as there's a desire, there's going to be a competition for what seems rare and valuable. It's simply human nature to do so, and history is written based on how we interact with ourselves, other people, and the things around us. Not always in a good way, but nature and art fascinate us, with gems bridging the gap from the natural world and our artful interpretation and fashioning them to fulfill our desires. Thank you very much. Questions? Wasn't too technical, so there's probably, yes. Not too hard now.
Do you or we or anybody know where the Orloffs are and who now owns La Peregrina?
The Orloffs, to my knowledge, were lost. The one, of course, that went to Catherine would have been probably sold off during the Bolshevik Revolution, but a lot of these, change hands, change shape. I think we learned from the Hope that it doesn't take much to take a significant diamond. It's kind of like polishing a number off the girdle in this day and time, but I think people are always clever where there's a dollar to be made or someone to be deceived. But the Orloffs, to my knowledge, we have no clue. La Peregrina was sold, I think, to a private collector and hasn't been seen or heard from since.
It was sold at Christie's.
Yes, it was sold at public auction, but I think it was to an undisclosed person. That question was, do we know what happened to La Peregrina? So if you didn't hear that. Anything? Yes?
You have a handout on the museum, but why don't you talk a little bit about your collection and how this all came to be with the university?
Sure, I'd love to. So, as some of you know, I was the manager for Gem A for North America. We've been working very closely with the University of Arizona here in Tucson. And last year we got an endowed professor. At the time we called it an endowed professor of gemology. It's since been renamed to an endowed professor of gem science. The University of Arizona is in the process of hiring a professor that will teach mineralogy based on gems. It's the only place in the United States that will offer a undergraduate, master's, and graduate with a concentration in gem science, or gemology as we all know. We've had an outstanding mineral museum. It's buried in the basement of the planetarium. No one really knows it's there. We were offered one entire wing of the Pima County Courthouse building, the most historic building in southern Arizona. Try not to move. For a new museum, 4 times the display space, research lab, and a community space on the lower level, and I'm managing the build out of that project. So we hope to open probably September of next year. We had hoped for the gem show, but when you're in town, Gem Show 2021, you're all invited as my guests to come and see our collections. Thank you for asking. Anything else? Okay, I'll free you up to go shopping. Thanks for coming out on a cold, rainy morning.